Imagine a promise so desperate it tore through the silence between heaven and earth. A vow spoken in blood and fear that would echo through eternity. The year was dark. Israel trembled, and one man stood at the crossroads between victory and unthinkable loss. His name was Jephthah, son of shame, warrior of the forgotten, a man who had nothing left to lose except the one thing he loved most. Picture this: the dust of battle settling, the sound of celebration rising from distant camps. A father walking toward home, his heart heavy with triumph and terror. For he knew what awaited him behind that door. He had made a bargain with the Almighty, a promise that seemed wise in desperation but would prove to be the most devastating words ever spoken by human lips. What drives a man to stake everything on a single vow? What happens when the God of the universe holds you to a promise you never should have made? Tonight you will discover the untold story of Jephthah, the rejected son who became a deliverer. The mighty warrior who faced his greatest enemy not on any battlefield but in the doorway of his own home. This is not just ancient history, this is the story of every desperate prayer, every impossible choice, every moment when faith and tragedy collide in the human heart. You are about to witness the promise that shook heaven itself. The sun scorched the hills of Gilead with merciless intensity. Dust devils danced across barren fields where nothing grew except thorns and the bitter memories of broken men. This was the frontier, the edge of the promised land where civilization ended and chaos began. Here, in the shadow of Ammonite raids and Moabite threats, lived the people time forgot. Shepherds with weathered faces, farmers with calloused hands. Women who aged before their time from worry and want. And somewhere among them walked a boy who carried shame like a second shadow. The land itself seemed to mirror the fractures in men's souls. To the east, the Jordan River carved its ancient path through valleys that had witnessed centuries of blood. Beyond those waters lay enemy territory, where the sons of Ammon sharpened their swords and planned their next assault on Israelite settlements. Gilead was not a place for the weak. It was a proving ground where survival demanded strength, cunning, and an iron will. The people here knew that their God had brought them to this promised land. But they also knew that promises required fighting to keep. In the markets of Mizpah, conversations whispered of darker things. Children born outside the bonds of marriage, bloodlines tainted by foreign women, families torn apart by questions of legitimacy and inheritance. The Israelites of Gilead lived by ancient codes. A man's worth was measured by his lineage, his father's name, his mother's reputation. Purity mattered, honor mattered, belonging mattered most of all. But what of those who belonged nowhere? In the shadows of respectable society lived another world entirely. Outcasts and wanderers. Men whose names were spoken in whispers. Those who had been cast out from their families, their inheritance stolen, their futures erased by the cruel mathematics of legitimacy. These forgotten sons learned different lessons. They learned that survival meant taking what others would not give. They learned that respect came through fear when it could not come through love. They learned that the world was not divided between good and evil, but between those who had power and those who did not. Among the olive groves and rocky hills, stories passed from mouth to mouth like wildfire, tales of the judges who had risen to deliver Israel from oppression. Othniel, who drove out foreign invaders down the Moabite Kingaders, Ehud, who struck with a hidden blade, Deborah, whose wisdom had rallied the tribes to victory. But those were stories of the chosen, the called, the blessed. What of the cursed? What of those born under clouds of scandal and shame? In the distance, smoke rose from cooking fires in respectable homes. Fathers gathered their legitimate sons around tables blessed by tradition and law. Mothers told bedtime stories of ancestors whose names were written in sacred genealogies. But beyond the circle of firelight, in places where shadows gathered thick, other stories were told. Stories of those who had been rejected but refused to disappear. Men who had carved their own destiny from the raw stone of a hostile world. The night air carried the sound of laughter from behind closed doors. But it also carried something else. The restless stirring of those who had been denied their place at the table. The quiet rage of the dispossessed. The growing strength of those who had learned to live without the blessing of others. In Gilead, the wind whispered of coming storms. Not just the storms of war that threatened from across the Jordan, but the deeper tempests that bruise in the human heart when injustice meets opportunity. For in this harsh and beautiful land, a boy was growing into manhood. A boy whose very existence challenged the comfortable certainties of his people. A boy who would one day stand before the elders who had rejected him and forced them to choose between their pride and their survival. His story was still being written in the dust and blood of forgotten places. But already those who knew how to read the signs could see the shape of destiny forming in the heat shimmer of the desert horizon. The land of Gilead was about to witness something unprecedented, the rise of the rejected, the vindication of the scorned, the moment when shame would transform into strength and the forgotten would become unforgettable. But first, that boy would have to survive his childhood. First, he would have to endure the cruelest education of all, learning that sometimes the greatest enemies are not the strangers beyond the border, but the family members who share your blood and deny your existence. The sun was setting over the hills of Gilead, and in that gathering darkness a future judge of Israel was it meant to be Unw, discovering Untold in the very land his people called home. His name was Jephthah, and he learned the word bastard before he learned to write his own name. The house where he was born stood at the edge of Mizpah, neither fully inside the town nor completely beyond its borders. Like the boy himself, it occupied that uncomfortable space between belonging and exile. His father was Gilead, a man of substance and reputation. Flocks dotted the hills under his ownership. His name carried weight in the councils of the elders. When he spoke, men listened. When he made decisions, they were respected. But Gilead had made one decision that would haunt his household for generations. In the back streets of the town lived a woman whose beauty was legendary and whose profession was whispered about in scandalized tones. She was not a wife. She could never be a wife. She was what respectable people called by many names, none of them kind. Yet Gilead had visited her. Not once, but many times. And from those visits had come consequences that no amount of silver could undo. The boy grew up knowing he was different. Not in the obvious ways that might have made life simpler. He was not weak or sickly or slow of mind. Indeed, he was stronger than his half-brothers, quicker to learn, more natural with weapons and strategy. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the question that followed him everywhere. Who was his mother? In the mornings he would watch his legitimate brothers prepare for their day. They moved through the world with an ease he envied, secure in their place, confident in their future. They knew that when their father died, they would inherit. They knew that when they married, their wives would be chosen from respectable families. They knew that their children would bear their names with pride. Jephthah knew none of these things. The servants in his father's house treated him with a careful neutrality that was somehow worse than outright cruelty. They could not ignore him, for he was Gilead's son. But they could not embrace him either, for his birth was a stain on the family honor. He learned to read the subtle language of rejection, the way conversations stopped when he entered a room, the way invitations were extended to his brothers but not to him, the way his father's eyes would avoid his when visitors came to discuss marriages and alliances. But the cruelest teacher was his father himself. Gilead loved the boy in his way. There were moments of tenderness, times when the older man would place his hand on Jephthah's shoulder and speak to him with genuine affection. But there were also times when Gilead would look at his illegitimate son and see only the reminder of his own weakness, his own failure to maintain the purity that his position demanded. The tension in the household grew like a cancer. Jephthah's legitimate brothers began to resent his presence more openly as they grew older. They saw how their father favored the bastard son in small ways, how Jephthah's natural abilities outshone their own. They began to whisper among themselves about inheritances and birthrights and the corruption of bloodlines. Their mother, Gilead's legitimate wife, said nothing openly, but her silence was loud enough. She had endured the humiliation of her husband's infidelity, had raised his illegitimate son under her own roof, had maintained the facade of a harmonious household. But her patience was not infinite. Jephthah felt it all, the growing hostility, the weight of expectations he could never fulfill, the knowledge that no matter what he accomplished, he would always be the outsider in his own family. He began to spend more time alone. In the hills surrounding Mizpah, he learned to track animals, to read the sky for weather, to survive on his own resources. He discovered that solitude was preferable to the company of those who merely tolerated his existence. But solitude also bred anger. Not the hot rage that burns itself out quickly, but the cold fury that smolders for years. Jephthah began to understand that the world was not fair, that birth determined destiny more than character or ability. He watched other young men his age as they prepared for their futures. They learned the rituals of worship, the laws of inheritance, the protocols of leadership. They were groomed to take their places in the community structure that had existed for generations. Jephthah learned different lessons. He learned to fight because he had to defend himself. He learned to lead because others naturally followed strength. He learned to think strategically because survival required planning ahead. Most importantly, he learned that respect could not be inherited. It had to be earned, and sometimes it had to be taken. The breaking point came when he reached manhood. His brothers, now confident in their own positions, decided that the pretense had gone on long enough. The family honor demanded a choice. Legitimacy or the bastard son? They chose legitimacy. The confrontation was brutal in its simplicity. No dramatic speeches or elaborate schemes, just a simple ultimatum delivered with the cold efficiency of men who had made up their minds. "Leave," they told him. "Take nothing that belongs to our father. Make your own way in the world. You were never truly one of us anyway." Jephthah looked at his father, hoping for intervention, for some defense of the son he had claimed to love, but Gilead's eyes were fixed on the ground. The old man had made his choice too. And so, with nothing but the clothes on his back and the bitter knowledge of betrayal, Jephthah walked away from the only home he had ever known. Behind him lay the ruins of every relationship he had cherished. Before him lay the uncertain path of the exile. But as he crested the hill that would take him out of sight of Mizpah forever, something else began to grow in his heart alongside the anger. A fierce determination, a promise to himself that he would not simply disappear into obscurity as his family hoped. He would return. Someday, somehow, he would return. And when he did, they would remember the name of the bastard son they had tried to forget. The boy who had learned rejection was about to teach the world about redemption. But first, he would have to survive the wilderness that waited beyond the borders of civilized society. The sun was setting behind him, casting long shadows across the path ahead. Jephthah walked into that gathering darkness without looking back. His childhood was over. His real education was about to begin. In the land of Tob, where the maps ended and legends began, mercy was a luxury few could afford. This was the frontier beyond the frontier, a harsh territory that lay east of Gilead, where the authority of judges held no sway and survival belonged to those strong enough to claim it. Here, among broken rocks and hidden valleys, gathered the unwanted of Israel. They came from everywhere and nowhere, younger sons with no inheritance, men fleeing debts they could not pay, warriors whose loyalty had been questioned, those who had loved unwisely or spoken too boldly or simply been born on the wrong side of fortune's wheel. They called themselves many things: adventurers, free men, brothers of the sword. But the world knew them by simpler names: outlaws, raiders, the dispossessed. Into this company of the forgotten came Jephthah, carrying nothing but his anger and his natural gifts for war. The first test came within hours of his arrival. Word of the newcomer spread quickly through the camps, and with it came the inevitable challenge. A scarred veteran named Kadesh, leader of one of the larger bands, decided to test the mettle of Gilead's cast-off son. The confrontation was swift and decisive. Jephthah had spent years learning to fight, but in Tob he discovered the difference between practicing with weapons and fighting for his life. When the dust settled, Kadesh lay unconscious in the sand, and the assembled outlaws looked upon their newest member with newfound respect. But respect in Tob was measured differently than in the civilized world. Here, it was earned not through bloodline or reputation, but through results. Could you lead men through hostile territory and bring them back alive? Could you plan raids that filled their purses without filling their graves? Could you inspire loyalty in those who had already been betrayed by everyone they had once trusted? Jephthah discovered he could do all these things and more. Within months, men began following him not because they feared him, but because he won battles. His strategic mind, sharpened by years of studying the movements of legitimate armies, found new application in the guerrilla warfare of the borderlands. He understood instinctively how to strike fast and disappear, how to use terrain to multiply his forces' effectiveness, how to turn the enemy's strength against them. But more than tactical brilliance, Jephthah possessed something rarer: the ability to unite men who had lost faith in unity. The outlaws of Tob were natural individualists, suspicious of authority, quick to abandon any leader who showed weakness. Yet they began to trust him because he trusted them. He gave them not orders but objectives, not commands but opportunities. Under his leadership, their raids became legendary. Caravans crossing the desert routes learned to fear the sight of his banner. Merchant princes hired extra guards when traveling through territories where Jephthah's name was whispered. Even the Ammonites, those ancient enemies of Israel, began to speak of the outlaw prince who struck like lightning and vanished like smoke. The success brought followers. What had begun as a small band of desperate men grew into something approaching a private army. Veterans of forgotten wars sought him out. Young men with nothing to lose begged to join his company. Even some from the settled lands, tired of the constraints of civilized life, abandoned their comfortable existence to follow the son of shame, who had made himself a legend. But success also brought attention from those who preferred the status quo. The established leaders of Gilead watched the rise of Jephthah with growing unease. They had cast him out to protect their own positions. But instead of disappearing quietly, he had become a power they could not control. Worse, his very existence challenged their authority. If a bastard son could command armies and win victories, what did that say about the legitimacy of their own rule? Some called for action against him. Send forces to destroy his camps, negotiate with the Ammonites to crush this upstart who threatened the delicate balance of power. Make an example of him before other dispossessed sons got similar ideas. But other voices counseled patience. Jephthah operated beyond their borders after all. His raids targeted foreign caravans and enemy settlements. If anything, his activities weakened Israel's enemies. Why interfere with something that served their interests, even if they could not claim credit for it? The debate raged in council meetings throughout Gilead. But while they argued, Jephthah continued to grow stronger. He established bases in hidden valleys where his men could train and rest between campaigns. He developed networks of informants who brought him intelligence about enemy movements and merchant schedules. He even began conducting diplomacy of sorts, negotiating temporary truces with rival outlaw bands and establishing territories of influence. Most importantly, he created something that had been denied to him in his father's house: a family of choice rather than blood. The men who followed him came to love him not as subjects love a king, but as brothers love a brother who has proven himself worthy of trust. They had all been rejected by someone somewhere. In Jephthah's company, they found acceptance based not on their past but on their present contributions. Around their campfires at night, they told stories of victories won and enemies defeated. They shared their dreams of the future and their bitter memories of the past. And gradually, they began to see themselves not as outcasts, but as the elite. Not but as the chosen of, as the rejected. A different sort of destiny had never known into these stories and felt something he, Jephthah, listened his legitimate house, belonging fathers. These men had chosen to follow him. They stayed not because they had to, but because they wanted to. They offered him loyalty freely given rather than respect grudgingly acknowledged. Yet even in triumph, even surrounded by faithful companions, something gnawed at his heart. He had proven himself to the world, but the world that mattered most, the world that had rejected him, remained beyond his reach. In quiet moments when the others slept and he kept watch under the desert stars, Jephthah's thoughts turned homeward, not with longing for what he had lost, but with a growing certainty about what he would one day reclaim. He had been cast out as a bastard, but he would return as a conqueror. The whispers of destiny grew stronger with each passing season. Something was building beyond the horizon, some crisis that would require more than legitimate blood and inherited authority to resolve. When that moment came, they would need someone who knew how to fight, someone who understood survival, someone who had been tested in the crucible of rejection and emerged stronger. They would need Jephthah, and he would be ready. The earth trembled beneath approaching hooves. Dust clouds rose like monuments to violence on the horizon. And somewhere in the distance, war drums echoed the rhythm of a desperate heart. The Ammonites had come. For months their raids had grown bolder, their demands more arrogant. They claimed the lands east of Jordan as their ancestral birthright, declaring that Israel's presence was theft, that their cities were built on stolen ground. Their king sent messengers with ultimatums written in blood and sealed with threats. "Return what you have taken," the messages read, "or we will take it back with sword and fire." The elders of Gilead gathered in emergency council as reports flooded in from the borderlands. Entire villages abandoned, crops burned in the fields, families fleeing westward with nothing but the clothes on their backs and terror in their eyes. These were not mere raids anymore. This was invasion. In the council chamber, voices rose in desperate debate. Some called for immediate surrender, arguing that resistance would only bring greater devastation. Others demanded they stand and fight, invoking the ancient promises of their God and the victories of past judges. But as the arguments raged, a darker truth settled over the assembly like smoke from burning towns. They had no leader capable of facing this threat. Their current judges were aging men, wise in counsel but too old for the brutal realities of warfare. Their younger commanders lacked the experience and the respect necessary to unite the fractious tribes of the region. They needed a general, a warrior, someone who understood both strategy and the savage mathematics of survival. They needed someone they had spent years trying to forget. The name hung unspoken in the air between them, as heavy as the smoke that drifted in through the windows. Everyone knew it. Everyone feared to say it aloud, because speaking that name would mean acknowledging their own failure, their own short-sightedness, their own desperate need for the very man they had cast away. Outside the walls of Mizpah, refugees continued to stream in from the eastern settlements. Women carried crying children. Old men leaned heavily on walking sticks, their eyes hollow with the weight of watching their life's work reduced to ash. Young men arrived with wounds hastily bandaged, speaking in hushed tones of enemy forces beyond counting. The Ammonite army was not just large, they reported. It was organized, disciplined, led by commanders who had studied the weaknesses of Israelite defenses and planned their assault with methodical precision. This was not the wild raiding of desert nomads, but the calculated aggression of a nation determined to reclaim what it considered its rightful territory. As night fell over the troubled city, the elders continued their deliberations behind closed doors. But in the streets outside, a different kind of council was forming. Veterans of old campaigns gathered in taverns and spoke in low voices about the realities they faced. Merchants who had traveled the trade routes shared intelligence about enemy movements. Mothers who had lost sons in previous conflicts wept and prayed for deliverance. And through it all, like a persistent whisper that refused to be silenced, Camelot Prince, who the stories of the ruled the Badlands beyond the Jordan. They spoke of his victories against impossible odds, his ability to unite disparate forces into effective fighting units, his reputation for tactical brilliance that had made him a legend among both friends and enemies. His name was spoken with a mixture of awe and reluctance, admiration and shame, for they all knew the truth that the elders were still too proud to acknowledge. Jephthah was the most capable military leader their people had produced in a generation, and they had driven him away. But pride has a way of crumbling when survival is at stake. And as the night wore on, as reports of Ammonite advances continued to arrive, as the magnitude of the threat became undeniable, even the most stubborn voices in the council began to soften. By dawn, a decision had been reached. Not unanimous, but decisive. They would swallow their pride and seek help from the son they had rejected. They would humble themselves before the bastard they had scorned. They would offer him the authority they had once denied him. But first, they would have to find him. And then, they would have to convince him to care about the fate of people who had made it clear they wanted nothing to do with him. The delegation that set out from Mizpah that morning carried no banners, no formal credentials, no marks of official authority. They were simply desperate men on a desperate mission, riding toward the wilderness where legends lived and exiles ruled. They rode in silence for the most part, each lost in his own thoughts about the magnitude of what they were attempting. They were about to ask a man they had wronged to risk his life for people who had rejected him. They were about to beg for mercy from someone they had shown none. The irony was not lost on any of them. The very qualities that had made them cast Jephthah out, his refusal to accept their social hierarchies, his independence of spirit, his willingness to challenge established authority, were precisely the qualities they now desperately needed as they crested the final hill before descending into the wild lands of Tob. The lead elder pulled up his horse and looked back toward home one final time. Smoke was still visible on the horizon, marking the location of settlements that would soon fall if their mission failed. Everything depended on what happened next. The survival of their cities, the safety of their families, the continuation of their way of life. Everything depended on whether the son of shame would agree to become their savior. The horses resumed their journey down into the valley where outcasts became kings and rejected sons learned to forge their own destiny. Behind them lay the world of legitimate authority and inherited privilege. Ahead lay the realm of earned respect and proven strength. Somewhere in that wilderness waited a man who held their fate in his hands. A man who had every reason to let them burn. The question that haunted their journey was simple. Would he choose vengeance or mercy? The camp sprawled across the valley like a city born of necessity and shaped by war. Tents of leather and cloth stretched in organized rows, their patterns speaking of military discipline rather than random settlement. Cook fires sent thin columns of smoke into the morning air, and the sound of weapons practice echoed off the surrounding hills. This was not the desperate hideout of common bandits, but the fortress of a legitimate power that acknowledged no king but strength. At its heart stood a tent larger than the others, marked not by ornamental banners but by the simple fact that men approached it with respect and left it with purpose. Here ruled the prince of the dispossessed, the general of the forgotten, the man who had transformed exile into empire. The delegation from Gilead was announced by scouts long before they reached the camp's perimeter. By the time they rode between the outer posts, word had already reached every corner of the settlement. The elders who had cast out their prince had come calling. Jephthah received them not in his tent, but in the open air where all could witness what transpired. He sat on a simple wooden chair, his sword across his knees, surrounded by the men who had followed him into the wilderness and stayed to build something unprecedented. The contrast was stark and intentional. The delegation wore the fine robes of their office, rode well-groomed horses, carried themselves with the dignity of inherited authority. Jephthah wore simple leather and mail, bore the scars of countless battles, and projected the quiet confidence of a man who had earned every ounce of respect he commanded. The lead elder, a man named Tobiah who had known Jephthah since childhood, dismounted and approached with careful steps. The words he had rehearsed during the long ride suddenly felt inadequate in the face of the reality before him. This was not the angry young man they had expelled. This was a seasoned commander who had built his own kingdom and owed them nothing. "Jephthah," Tobiah began, his voice carrying across the silent camp, "we have come to speak with you about a matter of great urgency." The response came not immediately, but after a pause that let the weight of the moment settle. When Jephthah finally spoke, his voice carried no anger, no bitterness, no emotion at all. It was the voice of a man conducting business with strangers. "Speak then, elders of Gilead. What brings you to the land of the forgotten?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Everyone present understood its deeper meaning. These were the men who had declared him unwelcome in civilized society. Now they stood in his domain, asking for audience, dependent on his mercy. Tobiah swallowed his pride and continued. "The Ammonites have invaded our territory. Their armies sweep across our eastern settlements like wildfire. Our people flee before them and our defenses crumble. We face the destruction of everything our fathers built." "And what," Jephthah asked with deadly quiet, "does this have to do with me? I am, as you once made clear, no son of Gilead. I have no inheritance there, no responsibilities, no obligations. Why should the troubles of strangers concern the king of Tob?" The words cut deep because they were perfectly just. Jephthah had every legal and moral right to turn them away. They had rejected him when he needed them. He could reject them now that they needed him. But Tobiah pressed on, driven by desperation and the knowledge that failure meant the end of everything he had spent his life protecting. Because you are still our brother. Because your people are threatened along with ours. Because you alone have the skill and the strength to face this enemy. My people. Jephthah's voice carried the faintest hint of amusement. These are my people. He gestured to the warriors surrounding them. Men who found me worthy of their loyalty. Men who follow me by choice rather than obligation. Men who have never questioned my legitimacy or found my birth wanting. The silence that followed was deafening. Every man in the camp understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. The moment when the rejected confronted those who had rejected them, when power relationships were revealed in their true form, when the comfortable certainties of the past were stripped away to reveal the desperate realities of the present. Finally, another elder spoke. This was Machir, a younger man who had not been part of the original decision to exile Jephthah but had inherited its consequences. We were wrong, he said simply. We allowed pride and custom to blind us to your worth. We cast out our strongest son and called it righteousness. We see now what folly that was. Jephthah studied the faces before him with the calculating gaze of a general assessing enemy positions. These men had come not as equals seeking alliance, but as supplicants begging for salvation. The reversal of fortune was complete and absolute. And what do you offer? He asked Tumuldu, for this salvation you seek. The answer came slowly, forced out by the crushing weight of necessity. Leadership, Tobiah said, command of our armies. Authority over our defenses, recognition as our general and judge. The same authority you denied me when I was merely your brother. Jephthah's question carried no heat, but its implications burned like acid. Now, when your backs are to the wall and your enemies at the gate, you offer me what should have been mine by right. Yes, Machir answered when Tobiah could not. We offer you what we should have given freely because we need what only you can provide. Jephthah rose from his chair and walked to where his horse waited. For a moment, the delegation thought he might simply mount and ride away, leaving them to face their fate alone. But instead he stood with one hand on the animal's neck, looking eastward toward the homeland that had rejected him and it. If the enemy that threaten I come, he said finally, it will not be as your hired sword or temporary commander. It will be as your acknowledged leader, your recognized judge, your permanent authority over military and civil affairs. Is this acceptable to the council that once found me unworthy of a place at their table? The price was steep, but the alternative was annihilation. Tobiah looked at his companions, saw the same desperate calculation in their eyes, and gave the only answer possible. It is acceptable. Jephthah turned back to face them, and for the first time since their arrival, something like a smile touched his features. But it was not a smile of triumph or vindication. It was the complex expression of a man who had just agreed to risk everything for people who had given him nothing but pain. Then I will come, he said, but understand this clearly. I do not come as your grateful son returning home. I come as your chosen leader accepting responsibility. The past is buried. The future begins now. And in that future, we face the enemy not as the divided people we have been, but as the united force we must become. The transformation was immediate and electric. Orders flew across the camp as Jephthah's captains began organizing for march. Weapons were gathered, supplies loaded, horses saddled. Within hours, the scattered bands of outlaws were becoming a disciplined army preparing to defend a homeland most of them had never seen. But as the delegation prepared to return with news of their success, Jephthah pulled Tobiah aside for a private word. "Know this, old man," he said quietly. "I accept your offer not for your sake or even for the sake of those who cast me out. I accept because there are innocent lives at stake, children who had no part in the decisions that shaped my exile. I will fight for them. I will die for them if necessary. But I will never forget the lesson you taught me about the true nature of loyalty and belonging." Tobiah nodded, understanding that he was witnessing not just political negotiation, but the culmination of a journey that had begun in rejection and arrived at a form of redemption more complex than simple forgiveness. As the sun reached its zenith, two forces began moving toward a confrontation that would determine the fate of nations. From the east came the armies of Ammon, confident in their strength and certain of their rights. From the west came the outcast prince and his followers, riding toward a destiny none could have predicted. The stage was set for a battle that would be remembered not just for its military outcome, but for the profound transformation it represented. The rejected son was coming home not as a prodigal seeking forgiveness, but as a deliverer carrying salvation. But the greatest test still lay ahead, for Jephthah was about to discover that some victories come at a price too terrible to contemplate, and some promises once spoken cannot be taken back. The road back to Gilead stretched before them like a bridge between two different worlds. Behind lay the wild lands of Tob, where strength alone determined worth, and every man had earned his place through deed rather than birth. Ahead waited the civilization that had shaped and then rejected him, with its complex hierarchies and ancient grievances, its comfortable certainties now shattered by approaching war. Jephthah rode in silence, his mind already working through the challenges that awaited. This was not simply a military problem to be solved with tactics and courage. This was a test of his ability to unite people who had never truly been united, to forge an effective force from fractious tribes who trusted their neighbors only slightly more than their enemies. The delegation that had sought him out rode alongside his advance guard, their relief at his acceptance mingled with growing awareness of what they had set in motion. They had invited a wolf to guard their sheep, hoping he had learned to distinguish between predator and protector. The next weeks would reveal whether their desperate gamble would prove salvation or catastrophe. As they crested the hills overlooking the Jordan Valley, the scope of the crisis became visible. Smoke columns marked the locations of burned settlements. Streams of refugees clogged the westward roads, carrying their possessions in carts and bundles, their faces etched with the particular exhaustion that comes from losing everything built over generations. But Jephthah's eyes were drawn not to the evidence of Ammonite destruction, but to the defensive positions his people had attempted to establish. Even at a distance, he could see the fundamental flaws in their strategy. Scattered strong points that could be isolated and overwhelmed. Supply lines stretched too thin to maintain. Retreat routes that led nowhere but deeper into disaster. "How long since the invasion began?" he asked Tobiah. 3 weeks, maybe 4. Time blurs when every day brings new catastrophe. Jephthah nodded, his assessment growing grimmer. A month of defeats had broken the spirit of resistance before he ever arrived. His first task would not be winning battles, but convincing his people that battles could still be won. They reached Mizpah as the sun was setting, painting the ancient stones of the city walls in shades of gold and crimson. The streets were crowded with refugees and buzzing with the nervous energy of a community under siege. Merchants hawked supplies at inflated prices. Mothers clutched children close. Old men sat in doorways and spoke of previous wars in voices that carried no confidence about the outcome of this one. Word of Jephthah's arrival spread through the city like wildfire. People emerged from shops and houses to catch a glimpse of the outlaw prince who had agreed to become their salvation. Some stared with open curiosity, others with barely concealed suspicion, a few with the desperate hope of those who had exhausted all other options. The formal ceremony took place in the city's central square, where a hastily constructed platform allowed the entire population to witness the transfer of authority. The elders performed the ancient rituals with careful precision, invoking the traditions that legitimized their decision while glossing over the irregularities that made it necessary. But when Jephthah stepped forward to accept the symbols of leadership, the staff of command and the seal of judgment, his words carried no reference to tradition or legitimacy. Instead, he spoke with the practical directness of a man who had learned leadership in the crucible of survival. "Citizens of Gilead," his voice carried clearly across the packed square, "I stand before you not as your rightful heir or chosen son, but as your necessary leader in desperate times. I make no promises about easy victory or painless solutions. I offer only my commitment to fight for your survival with every resource at my disposal." The crowd listened in tense silence. This was not the inspiring rhetoric they expected from their leaders, but the hard honesty of someone who understood the true cost of war. "The enemy is strong," Jephthah continued, "but not invincible. They are organized, but not more organized than we can become. They are determined, but not more determined than people fighting for their homes and families. Victory is possible, but only if we are willing to pay its price." That night in the war council that assembled in the governor's hall, Jephthah began the real work of transformation. Maps covered the tables, marked with enemy positions and friendly forces. Scouts reported on Ammonite movements while supply officers calculated resources and transportation. Veterans of previous campaigns shared their knowledge of terrain and tactics. But the most important work happened in the spaces between formal discussions, as Jephthah began the delicate process of welding competing factions into a unified command structure. Tribal leaders who had spent decades nursing ancient grievances had to learn to cooperate or watch their people perish. Regional commanders who had never acknowledged each other's authority had to coordinate their efforts or see their separate defeats become collective annihilation. Jephthah's approach was neither diplomatic nor authoritarian, but something more subtle and effective. He listened carefully to every voice, acknowledged every concern, but made decisions based purely on military necessity. Personal disputes were set aside for later resolution. Territorial claims were temporarily suspended. Ancient protocols were modified or discarded when they interfered with effective operations. "We can settle our differences after we survive them," he told one group of arguing chieftains. "But first we must ensure there is an after to argue about." Within days, the transformation was visible. Supply lines were reorganized for efficiency rather than tradition. Command structures were simplified to eliminate redundancy and confusion. Training began immediately for militia forces who would supplement the professional warriors. But Jephthah's most important innovation was psychological rather than tactical. He began visiting the refugee camps, speaking directly to families who had lost everything to Ammonite raids. He listened to their stories, acknowledged their losses, and made personal commitments about recovery and justice. More significantly, he began incorporating refugees into his military planning. Men who had fled their homes carried detailed knowledge of enemy positions and movements. Women who had managed supply chains for their communities understood logistics in ways that professional soldiers often missed. Even children who had witnessed attacks could provide crucial intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions. The effect was electric. People who had felt helpless and abandoned suddenly found themselves contributing to their own salvation. The army was no longer something imposed from above, but something growing from the community itself. Yet even as confidence began to return to Gilead, Jephthah felt the weight of borrowed authority pressing on his shoulders. These people were trusting him with everything they had left. Their lives, their futures, their children's inheritance all depended on decisions he would make in the coming weeks. Late at night, when the councils ended and the reports were filed, he would walk the walls of Mizpah and stare eastward toward the enemy camps. The responsibility was crushing, not because he doubted his abilities, but because he understood too clearly what failure would mean. In the distance, Ammonite watchfires dotted the horizon like fallen stars. Behind each light waited warriors who believed they were reclaiming stolen land, led by commanders who had planned this campaign for years. Backed by a king who saw this as his opportunity to reshape the balance of power in the region. Jephthah had faced long odds before, but never with so much depending on the outcome. In Tob, failure meant personal defeat and the scattering of his followers. Here, failure meant the end of a civilization. As he stood in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the first hints of light touch the eastern hills, a new thought began forming in his mind. Something beyond tactics and strategy, beyond the careful calculations of military planning. Something that touched the deepest foundations of faith and fate. He had been given authority to command armies and direct battles. But what if the situation required more than human leadership could provide? What if victory demanded intervention from powers beyond the reach of sword and strategy? The thought was dangerous because it led to possibilities he was not sure he was prepared to contemplate. But as the sun rose over the threatened land, illuminating both the scope of the crisis and the magnitude of what was required to resolve it, Jephthah began to understand that some battles could only be won through means that transcended ordinary warfare. The stage was being set for something unprecedented, not just a military campaign, but a confrontation between human will and divine purpose, between the authority of men and the sovereignty of heaven itself. What happened next would depend not just on tactical brilliance or strategic planning, but on whether a man who had spent his life earning respect through strength alone was prepared to stake everything on a promise that reached beyond the visible world into realms where victory and defeat were measured by different standards entirely. The greatest test was still to come, and it would require not just the courage to fight, but the faith to believe that some promises were worth more than life itself. The war camp outside Mizpah hummed with the nervous energy of an army preparing for battle, but beneath the surface activity lay currents of doubt that no amount of drilling could dispel. Jephthah walked among his forces in the gray hours before dawn, observing the careful choreography of military preparation. Weapons were sharpened with methodical precision. Armor was checked and rechecked. Supplies were distributed according to calculations refined over centuries of warfare. Everything proceeded according to established protocols, yet something fundamental was missing. The men moved with the mechanical efficiency of those following orders rather than the fierce determination of warriors fighting for their deepest convictions. They would follow him into battle because duty demanded it, because their leaders had commanded it, because no alternative remained. But they had not yet found the fire that transforms soldiers into forces of destiny. Jephthah understood the problem intimately. He had built his reputation leading men who chose to follow him, who believed in his vision because they had witnessed his victories. These troops were different. They served not from conviction but from necessity, not from trust but from desperation. Among the tribal leaders, the resistance subtle was more erosive. They, but equally core, had accepted his authority publicly, but in private conversations they questioned his methods, criticized his innovations, and wondered aloud whether their desperate gamble might prove worse than their original crisis. "He fights like a brigand," one chieftain muttered to his companions around a late-night fire. "No respect for proper formations, no understanding of honorable combat. Are we to become outlaws in our own defense?" Others raise different concerns. His men are loyal to him personally, not to our cause. What happens after victory? Will he step aside gracefully, or have we simply traded Ammonite occupation for the rule of an upstart bastard? The whispers reached Jephthah's ears, as whispers always do. But rather than confront the dissent directly, he chose a more subtle approach. He began sharing his plans more openly, explaining his reasoning, inviting input from commanders who had initially viewed him with suspicion. The effect was gradual but transformative. Leaders who had expected to be ignored found their expertise valued. Veterans who had anticipated being displaced discovered their experience integrated into new tactical approaches. The army began to cohere not through imposed discipline but through growing understanding of shared purpose. Yet even as unity strengthened within his forces, external pressures mounted with each passing day. Ammonite raids penetrated deeper into Israelite territory. targeting not just military objectives but the psychological foundations of resistance. They burned fields ready for harvest, poisoned wells, and left behind evidence of their presence designed to spread fear rather than simply cause damage. More troubling were the messages that accompanied these attacks. Proclamations written in Hebrew and posted in prominent locations where survivors would find them. The words were carefully chosen to divide rather than simply intimidate. "People of Israel," one such message read, "your leaders have brought this suffering upon you through their stubborn refusal to acknowledge justice. We seek only the return of lands stolen from our fathers. Submit to righteous authority and this conflict ends. Continue to resist and watch your children pay the price of your elders' pride." The psychological warfare was sophisticated and effective. Refugees arriving in Mizpah brought not just reports of military activities but questions that gnawed at communal resolve. Why should they suffer for territorial disputes that preceded their births? How could resistance be justified when submission might bring peace? Jephthah found himself fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, against enemy forces that grew bolder with each success, against internal dissension that threatened to fragment his coalition before it ever faced the test of battle, against his own doubts about whether victory was possible even under the best circumstances. In the war councils that convened each evening, strategic discussions increasingly gave way to debates about fundamental questions of justice and survival. Elders who had lived through previous conflicts spoke of the cyclical nature of these territorial wars, suggesting that accommodation might prove wiser than resistance. "We have survived as a people by adapting to changing circumstances," one aging counselor argued. "Perhaps the time has come to acknowledge new realities rather than cling to old claims. Better to lose some land than to lose everything in futile defiance." Jephthah listened to these debates with growing frustration. Not because the arguments lacked merit, but because they revealed a failure to understand what was truly at stake. This was not merely a territorial dispute that could be resolved through negotiation and compromise. This was an existential challenge to everything their community had built over generations. "You speak of accommodation," he finally responded during one particularly contentious session. "But accommodation assumes the enemy shares your desire for peaceful coexistence. Look at their actions, not their proclamations. They do not seek to negotiate boundaries. They seek to eliminate our presence entirely." To prove his point, he had scouts bring captured documents from Ammonite camps. Military orders that spoke not of occupation but of deportation. Supply requisitions that planned for permanent settlement rather than temporary conquest. Correspondence between enemy commanders that revealed their true intentions with brutal clarity. The evidence was sobering, but it also clarified the choice before them. This was not a conflict where surrender offered safety. This was a fight for survival that could only end with victory or annihilation. Yet even this understanding could not resolve the deeper challenge Jephthah faced. Military victory required more than tactical skill and strategic planning. It demanded the kind of unity and determination that could only emerge from shared conviction about ultimate purposes. His followers from Tob possessed this conviction. They had chosen exile over submission, hardship over compromise. They would fight with the desperate courage of men who had already lost everything except their freedom to choose their own deaths. But the broader population remained conflicted. They wanted safety more than victory, survival more than triumph. They would fight if they must, but they lacked the transcendent motivation that transforms ordinary soldiers into instruments of destiny. Standing alone on the walls of Mizpah during the long watches of the night, Jephthah wrestled with problems that seemed to have no human solution. He commanded forces sufficient to mount effective resistance, but insufficient to guarantee victory. He led people willing to defend themselves but unwilling to sacrifice everything for abstract principles of independence. What he needed was something beyond military capability or political unity. He needed the kind of intervention that could transform the possible into the inevitable, that could bridge the gap between human effort and divine purpose. The thought formed slowly in his mind, shaped by memories of stories told around campfires in the wilderness. Tales of judges who had faced impossible odds and found supernatural assistance. Accounts of battles won not through superior numbers or tactics, but through the direct intervention of powers beyond human understanding. But such intervention, the stories suggested, came at a price. Not just the willingness to fight, but the faith to stake everything on outcomes that transcended visible reality. Not just courage in the face of danger, but trust in purposes larger than personal survival or political advantage. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jephthah found himself contemplating possibilities that went far beyond conventional military planning. He was approaching the edge of a decision that would either elevate his campaign to levels of significance he had never imagined, or doom it to consequences too terrible to contemplate. The enemy was strong, but strength alone had never determined the outcome of the conflicts that shaped history. The people were divided, but unity could emerge from shared experience of the impossible made real. What was needed was a demonstration that some causes were worth more than life itself, a proof that heaven itself had chosen sides in this struggle. A sign that would transform reluctant defenders into willing instruments of divine purpose. The sun rose over the threatened land, illuminating both the magnitude of the crisis and the potential for transformation that lay hidden within it. Somewhere beyond the horizon, enemy forces were preparing for what they expected to be their final assault on Israelite resistance. They had no way of knowing that their opponents were about to receive reinforcement from sources they could neither predict nor understand. The age of resistance was about to become something far more powerful and far more dangerous. The age of promises that would shake heaven itself. The altar stood in silence under the canopy of stars, its ancient stones bearing witness to countless offerings across generations of faithful pilgrimage. Here, in the sacred grove outside Mizpah, patriarchs had sought divine favor before great undertakings. Kings had brought their tribute before crucial battles. Ordinary people had laid their burdens before the one who sees all things and judges with perfect wisdom. Tonight it would witness something unprecedented, a promise so desperate, so absolute that its very utterance would echo through eternity. Jephthah knelt before the altar alone. His commanders slept in their tents, exhausted by days of preparation and planning. His soldiers rested fitfully, knowing that dawn would bring the march toward destiny. The city behind him lay wrapped in the uneasy quiet that precedes great events. But sleep eluded the man who carried the weight of their hopes and fears. Instead, he found himself drawn to this place of ancient power, seeking something beyond human counsel or earthly wisdom. The intelligence reports painted a grim picture. Ammonite forces outnumbered his own by margins that made conventional victory unlikely. Their commanders were experienced veterans who had studied Israelite tactics for years. Their supply lines were secure, their morale high, their confidence justified by months of unopposed success. Against these realities, Jephthah could offer only the desperate courage of people fighting for their survival and the tactical innovations he had learned in the wilderness. It might be enough. It might not. The margin between triumph and catastrophe was razor thin. In the darkness before the altar, he struggled with the fundamental question that haunts every leader facing impossible odds. How far was he willing to go to secure victory for those who depended on him? The answer came not as a sudden revelation, but as a growing certainty that had been building for days. This was not merely a military conflict between neighboring peoples. This was a test of whether the God of Israel still defended his chosen people, whether the ancient promises still held power, whether faith could still move the immovable. But divine intervention, the stories taught, required human commitment that went beyond ordinary devotion. The great judges of the past had staked everything on their trust in divine purpose. They had wagered not just their lives, but their deepest treasures on outcomes they could not control or guarantee. Jephthah raised his eyes to the star-filled heavens and felt the weight of that tradition settling on his shoulders like a mantle both glorious and terrible. Lord God of Israel, his voice barely disturbed the night air. You have seen the oppression of your people. You have witnessed the arrogance of those who claim your inheritance as their own. You know the terror that stalks our children and the despair that whispers in our elders' hearts. The words came slowly at first, then with gathering momentum as the full scope of his commitment crystallized in his mind. If you will deliver the Ammonites into my hand, if you will grant victory to your people through this unworthy servant, then I swear by your holy name that whatever comes forth from the doors of my house to meet me when I return in triumph shall be yours alone. The vow hung in the air like incense, ascending toward heaven with the weight of absolute sincerity. But even as he spoke the words, something within him whispered warnings about promises made in desperation, about the unforeseen consequences of bargains struck with the divine. In the end, Jephthah's story refuses to offer us the comfort of simple answers or easy moral conclusions. His name echoes through history not as a warning against rash promises, but as a testament to the terrible complexity of faith itself. We have walked with him from rejection to redemption, from exile to authority, from desperate vow to devastating fulfillment. We have witnessed how the forgotten can become unforgettable, how the rejected can reshape the very foundations of their world. But perhaps most importantly, we have seen how the human heart wrestles with forces beyond its comprehension, yet never stops reaching toward meaning. The promise that shook heaven was born not from arrogance but from love, not from calculation but from the desperate faith of a man who had learned that sometimes the greatest victories require the greatest sacrifices. In that midnight moment before the altar, Jephthah joined the ranks of those who stake everything on purposes larger than themselves. His legacy lives on in every parent who would give anything to protect their children, in every leader who bears the weight of impossible decisions, in every human heart that chooses love over safety and meaning over comfort. The rejected son of Gilead became something eternal, a reminder that our deepest wounds often become our greatest sources of strength. The ancient stones of that altar have long since crumbled to dust. The armies that marched across those hills have been forgotten by history, but the echo of that promise still reverberates through every soul that has ever stood at the crossroads between faith and fear, between the possible and the necessary. What promises have you made in the darkness of your own desperate hours? What vows echo in the chambers of your heart?